Hi, and welcome back to the Strategic Targeting Podcast. Now, this is the show where we take a step back, look at our businesses from a strategic perspective instead of just always transactional or tactical. Today, we're going to be talking about change. And to talk about how to manage that more effectively, I have Estie Briggs with us today. She's the owner of Briggs Performance Consulting. She knows an incredible amount about change, and she's going to share it with us right after this. Estie, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, Rick, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, you and I have visited in the past about change management and what you're doing at Briggs Performance Consulting. I was very impressed. And I was hoping you'd join us today and talk a little bit about the way you think of change and change management. So put it in perspective for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And I've seen change executed well, and I've seen it and been on the receiving end of it being executed poorly. And it's funny because at the time that I was in it, I didn't know all these different models that I've learned throughout my education and my career. But I really love thinking of change as an ending. And I know a lot of us hear about change and we think of it as a beginning. It's like, oh, it's new, it's some new way we're going to do things. And this model comes from William Bridges. So if anybody wants to nerd out, I'm happy to go as deep as you want, but just to keep it, conversational and digestible. Bridges paints a picture of change as always beginning with something ending. And I think what we lose sight of, and a lot of executives that I work with, is that we think change, and I'm speaking of change as in this context, it's organizational change and it's intentional change, something that's being rolled out in order to either remain competitive or improve profitability, or there's some necessary reason for the change. Usually the stakeholders, the main decision makers, have already identified the need for the change and they're in agreement that the change needs to happen. But what I would encourage people to think about if they are rolling out change is what's ending for the people that are going to be impacted by the change. And the reason I invite you to think about it as an ending is because a lot of times we don't think about the fact that we're going to ask people to start working in a new way. And that can be really scary and uncomfortable for people. And I have an analogy that I'll refer to, which is when I was in the mortgage industry, we transitioned to paperless software. And I know that by now anybody that's in the mortgage industry that's listening to this has probably been paperless for a while, but people get really good at doing a task and they feel good about being competent at it. And when you've got, depending on what size the change is, when you've got dozens or hundreds or thousands of people that are used to doing things a certain way, and now you're changing to a new way, you might see all the benefits of the new way, but you need to take into account the fact that the old way that they've done things is now ending for them. And believe it or not, in a way, they go through stages of grief over that ending. And that's why sometimes people can be really resistant to change. They don't like having that feeling of competence taken away. And so that's one of the things that I always bring up first is if you're implementing a change, what's going to be ending for the people that are affected by it? And then the conversation can go from there. But it is a beginning of doing it something a new way, but there's also always something that's ending, and that may be very real for the people that you're asking to change. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Esty, that makes perfect sense. And we've seen that time and time again in every company, in every industry, whether it's an M&A event, a new technology application, or anything else. But I like your idea of zooming out and looking at the end state, because when you're in the middle of a change, it's hard to see beyond just the next thing that's going away, or what am I going to do with that next step or whatnot. Now, do you find when you're consulting with companies, they understand how to share that in state with the people that they're trying to manage through this change?
That's a great question. Not always necessarily. There might be a picture that they've painted about what the end state or what the future state looks like, but excuse me, but I think that the when you can get the magic to happen is when you can find people that are going to be impacted by the change to help you paint that picture. So it's one thing to say, oh, we're going to switch to paperless software. But it's another to grab an underwriter or funder or, somebody that's going to be impacted by the end state and say, what would this look like for you? And how might this change how you do your job? And what would be some of the benefits to that? So there's a lot of pre-work you can do that by the time you're rolling out the change, hopefully you've got some people that you've at least gotten them excited about it or at least open to it. You never want to surprise people. I've seen that happen and it never ends well. Um, so,
Exactly. Exactly. Now, Esty, I knew you before in your previous work life, and now you're consulting with companies to help them manage through change. Why do you think that this is more important now? Why did you choose to go in this direction with the rest of your career?
yeah, that's a great question. Well, I touched on earlier that I've been in the employee's shoes plenty of times where I see change implemented not so well. And I don't think it's anybody, and that's not to like criticize any CEOs that I ever worked for. Um, but I think I just have that mindset. And I just posted about this yesterday on LinkedIn. Somebody told me once, oh, you think like a purple person. And I'm like, what the heck does that mean? And, in most organizations, hopefully you've got people that speak the tech. And so if you consider that like a language, it's like the IT people speak red and maybe the operations or the business people speak blue. And a lot of times they can't get on the same page. And I think I've been able to cross that divide and I get enough of the tech. Like I'll never be a developer, like in no universe ever will I be doing anything like that. But I understand what they need to know in order to make the changes that people need. And so I think that that's what I love is I don't mind being in the weeds and helping to implement the change. But I think I operate better when I can zoom out, like you said, and look at the big picture and ask the big questions like, well, who else is going to be impacted? Well, what do they need to know? When do they need to know it? How are they going to feel about it? People blow that off easily. And I think especially now, to come back to your question, people are going through a lot of what we call change fatigue because we did have to change so abruptly and we had to pivot so much during the pandemic and in the years that have followed. We're kind of exhausted by change, but it's not going anywhere. And so I think it's more important than ever for leaders to be empathetic about it. And that's the other thing that I teach and am passionate about is emotional intelligence. And I think the two things they marry well together if you can be empathetic and also self-aware and also flexible. You're going to have a better time and a better end result as a leader trying to implement that change.
Yeah. Yeah. All things that we rather wish had been part of the curriculum for leaders 30, 40 years ago, but just wasn't, right? So, and I know you've earned a certification in that too, as far as teaching and training emotional intelligence. That's great. Now, I think most of my viewers know that failing to manage change properly means that they're not going to get an ROI on whatever they're trying to change and they're going to have trouble. But beyond that, what are the risks of not getting this right?
There's a statistic that I've read many times that your viewers may have read as well that 75% of change efforts fail. And I don't know how they got to that exact calculation, but when you think about the amount of energy and expense that's put into making a change effort work, um, the risk is losing all of that. But it's bigger than just the cost of the fail. There's also the impact to the people that get affected. And I can't tell you how many times I've come in to an organization and they're like, okay, we need to be sensitive because we tried to do this with a different provider last year and it didn't go well. And now we don't talk about it. You can see how it just like ripples out when it doesn't go well. And so even though some of the things that I, recommend, like doing an assessment to see how ready people are for the change, or building a coalition or a change team, those things might seem unnecessary and like they're going to drag things out, because in the beginning everybody's anxious to flip the switch and get to the change. But the more you can front load some of that effort and make sure that people feel heard, the better off you are.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Now, the upside, right? So we know if we can manage this right, and if only about a fourth of us are actually ever getting that right, that's scary in and of itself. It's good. We get a change implemented. It's fine. But what are the other benefits of managing change the right way from your perspective?
I think that if you do it right, you can there's a lot of benefits. I mean, other than the obvious benefits, which are, the change being adopted. If you include people that are impacted by the change, you can find, you might find some leaders that you didn't know you had. If you think about the people that are going to be asked to work in a new way, if you were to take them and put them on the I'll call it the change committee. There's always like, you always want to have some sort of small team, and then the more people that are affected by the change, the bigger you need the team to be in order to help win the hearts and minds of the people that you're trying to get to change. But if you can be strategic about the people that you choose to be on that team, you can bring out the best in people. People like being able to show up and have their voices heard. And even if they're in maybe an entry level role, if they can be part of rolling that change out, they spread that. Just like negativity spreads, positivity spreads. And so if you get the right people on your team and you listen to them, and even if all their ideas don't get implemented, if they at least have that opportunity to be heard, they're going to go back and tell their friends, because they're the ones that are in the trenches and they're the ones that are doing the job. Maybe they're not all in cubicles grumbling next to each other, but I guarantee you they're on Skype or chat or text. And so what you want to spread is the positive effects of the change. And so that's some of the upsides, I think, is that you can really help influence people, and you can also start to see who your leaders are in the company that you might not have considered.
Absolutely. And what a great tool for recruitment and retention. That
Yeah.
sounds like a real benefit if they
Yeah.
can manage it right. We've been
100%.
talking to Estie Briggs. She's the owner of Briggs Performance Consulting,
Correct.
someone that you should definitely know. Estie, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rick.
And thanks to all of you. We'll see you next time on the Strategic Targeting Podcast.